Well, welcome to our fourth week of our Lenten podcast. I am Jeremiah Childers.
I'm Kelly Kirksey.
Sarah Hanks.
And we are so glad that you have joined us today. Today, our focus is the power of forgiveness. But before we have forgiveness, we have to talk about the things that we've done. So our text today comes out of Psalm 32. Kelly, would you read that for us today?
All right. Happy are those whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Happy are those to whom the Lord imputes no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. While I kept silent, my body wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. Then I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not hide my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the guilt of my sin.
So our psalmist today describes in poetic language how sin that is in our lives to which we've not asked for forgiveness or worked out feeds on our spiritual selves, our physical selves, like cancer.
Yeah.
So as you wrote your Lenten devotional this week, what were some thoughts that you had about sin, Kelly?
Well, I think that it's something we don't really talk about that much anymore. And if we do talk about it, it's someone else's sin. Because it's so much easier to look at everybody else and think, wow, they're doing terrible. And it's not that we think we're doing so great, but it's so uncomfortable to talk about our own shortcomings. And, I just even now reading over this, was talking about that at the end, it talked about confessing your sins to God, and that's really the heart of it. I mean, we do have to go to our brothers and sisters and confess sins that we've done against them. But if we can't even confess our sins to God, then, that's when it's really, implanted itself in us. And I talked a little bit in the writing about how hard it is even to recognize our own sin. And that when we don't recognize it, it has kind of made it where it's difficult to tell where we are and where the sin is. And I think those are sins a lot of times like pride and issues that we don't even realize we're doing. And we have to ask God, convict me, which, gosh, that's a terrible request to go to. It's like asking for patience. You're going to get what you ask for, and that's painful.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the reflections, if you talked about looking at other people's sins, one thing I think about is when we look outside of ourselves, we look for sins, I think, sometimes that are taboo because they remind us that, or at least we think that we're not that bad.
Right.
Watching Dateline every Friday or Saturday night, murder. I've not done that.
We look so good compared to Dateline.
And usually it begins with an adultery or greed or something like that leads to murder. And we think to ourselves, okay, I'm not going to be on Dateline.
That's right.
Hopefully.
Hopefully, right?
Or we look at people that try to point out sins that would never affect us. Whatever that is considered to be a transgression of some sort or another, it's not something we would ever do. So it makes us feel safe when we talk about those other things. I love when Jesus, and we've talked some about this in our intergenerational discussions, but Jesus says, okay, adultery, murder, but let's go inward and talk about your heart. Do you have hate? Do you have holding on to unforgiveness? Are you looking at your neighbor with suspicion?
Jealousy.
Are you lusting? You can lust and only do it inside yourself.
Right.
So when we think about sin, if you were to define sin, what is your mental definition of sin? I think the biblical narrative often depicts it as missing the mark. We've heard that in terms of, if you had a bow and arrow and you were trying to hit something and you missed the target, you missed the mark. When you sin, you go away from God's purposes and wills for your life. But when you think about sin, if you were to have to tell somebody, maybe a young child or an older child, what sin is, how would you describe it?
Well, I think sin is hard because what I've always thought of growing up and everything was just that sin was anything that moved you away from God or that separated you from God. The problem with that, I think, as you get older is this idea of like, what does that mean? Like, what is the reality of that? Like, nobody know, like, no, there's no, yes, this is not. There's no black and white to that. It's very gray. And so I think that's what makes sin so complicated, and is when you can't, when someone else may say, well, that's a sin. Mm-hmm. And I may be like, well, I don't know that I think that is, does that separate you from God? And anyways, I think that's what makes it such a hard topic. But I always think about what Paul said when he said everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. Yeah. And that helps me a lot. And it's not where I say, well, this is a sin, but I say, this is not beneficial. Mm-hmm. And so if it's not beneficial, I probably do not need to be doing that. It doesn't matter whether it's a sin or not. Mm-hmm. It's not beneficial. And so I know that it's not what I need to be doing.
What about you, Sarah?
Yeah, I was just going to say, the New Testament just gives us kind of a layout of how we're supposed to be like Jesus. And basically, when I think about sin, it's just anything where I'm not reflecting his ways. Mm-hmm. So that could be like just being judgmental of someone that looks or is different than me, or so I think we just kind of, in my view, I just look to how Jesus was, and if I'm not following in his ways, then like you said, I'm missing the mark. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the gauge for me. And so when you look at it that way, you realize that you're sinning a lot on a daily basis,
For me, it's kind of this imagery in my mind is the thing I'm thinking, feeling, doing drawing me closer to God or farther away from God? Mm-hmm. Are the things that I'm thinking, doing, pulling people closer to me towards God, or pushing them away from me and away from God? I think of the idea, one writer talks about resistance. I think Walter Brueggemann talks about it in different ways. When we resist God and God's purposes for our life, it takes time to get back to where you need to be. And it's usually little things that start it. Mm-hmm. Nobody in the Old Testament, idolatry is kind of the big sin. Mm-hmm. Is when you put something in the place of God and you put your devotion and your life towards it. And most of the time in the Old Testament for God's people, when they begin to do idolatry, it's never right away. It's a little step here and there. So when Jesus talks about, you've probably not murdered, you've probably not committed adultery, but you have done these things. That's the step towards the thing that really it's hard to get back from. If you take somebody's life, it's hard to come back from that. If you break your covenant vows in marriage, it's hard to come back from that. Mm-hmm. There is forgiveness and possibility of restoration, but it's really, it takes a lot more work to get to where you need to be. So Jesus says, before you get there, look inside where you are and kind of come back towards God and towards other people. For me, it's that idea of resistance. And, if you're close to God, the initial resistance in sinning is hard. But if you continue to do it, you build up that muscle that allows you to continue to resist God. And over time, you can get so far away that it's hard to get back. Mm-hmm. And if you are that way, whether it's through forgiveness and grace, it takes time to get back to where you need to be with God. I don't think many people, in terms of the Christian journey, when they start off on the Christian journey, ever mean to get away from God. But sometimes it does happen.
Yeah.
I liked in your Lenten devotion, Kelly, that you focused on those three descriptions of sin: transgression, sin, and iniquity. Could you talk a little bit about those three terms?
Well, I just thought it was so interesting that in 2 verses he talks about these 3 terms, and so that there is kind of an emphasis on this. But I don't think we think of like transgress I was thinking a lot about this when I was writing it, and I couldn't really put it into words that made sense on a page. But but that when I think about transgressing, it's like I'm pushing a boundary, and I think we think about that with sin a lot. But I think it encompasses more than just this idea of, okay, well, I've done something I shouldn't have done. I mean, I think it also is, I have stepped into space I shouldn't be in.
Yeah.
I have moved in, like I have made a decision that was not mine to make, right? Not just with God. We do that all the time where we try to take control back. And so like I'm making choices even for my own life that are not mine to make. Mm-hmm. And then, but also with other people's lives, like I am choosing for this person what they need to be doing. I am letting them know that what they're doing is making me unhappy, and this is not really my space. Like Sarah talked about earlier, judgment, Jesus is like, listen, that's not your job. Like that is the sinless, the job of those who are perfect, which is only God and Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so when you step into those spaces, you've transgressed.
I love the imagery in Genesis when Cain is really upset with his brother, and God comes to Cain and essentially says, there's a door right there. And sin is lurking around the corner. And if you step through that door, it will devour you. Mm-hmm. And that boundary is there for us to be aware that there are certain places you should not go. And if you do go, then it will be all-consuming for you. Now, the wonderful story about that is not that, it's horrible that he kills his brother Abel. But God doesn't meet violence with violence in that story. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we see throughout the biblical narrative is that God is able to forgive things that for us would think unforgivable. Mm-hmm. But it also stops a perpetuation of sin. If Jesus says, you've heard it was said that you should hate your enemy. Well, of course you should. In a biblical worldview of somebody hurts you, you hurt them back. And you hope that stops hurting, but it just continues violence. And Jesus says to love your enemy, to pray for them. So for us, sometimes that boundary, if we can just look at it and say, okay, if we cross over, it's going to cause a lot of harm. It will essentially consume us. Right. And for a lot of people, I often wonder do they not contemplate what the effects of what they're about to do will have? If they take money at work, do they not play out what's going to happen later? If they start to flirt with somebody that's not their spouse, do they not play out in their head what could happen later? And I don't think many people, good or, followers of Jesus or not followers of Jesus, take the opportunity to look at that boundary and say, if I go across it, because most people run into it head first. Using their emotions. That part of the brain just kind of stops.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's also what you were talking about earlier, where this is not a one-time step. Right. These are very small steps. And I think in that process of those small steps, you surround yourself with people that this has become a norm for them. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so your line looks a lot grayer when you've put on these glasses of, well, this person they don't think it's wrong. Mm-hmm. And this person, they talk that way and they don't think there's anything wrong with it. All these people are laughing about this joke, or all these people are laughing about, crossing this line with someone that's not their spouse or whatever. And they all think it's fine. And it paints your reality. Yeah. And so all of a sudden that line isn't like, okay, well, if I cross this line, what are my options? It's like, well, is there a line? I don't know. Nobody else seems to think so, you know?
And I think sin sometimes, if we're not careful, it looks almost right. Mm-hmm. Like the biblical imagery is that humans oftentimes, whether it's idolatry or something similar, will trade the truth for a lie because it looks close enough and it fulfills some inward desire or inward purpose that you feel like you're not getting somewhere else. So you take gradual steps, but sometimes I always wonder if you got to that point where you think you're about to cross over that boundary, even if you've made short steps, there are people in your life that God has put there that can help you come back. And very rarely in ministry, one of the laments I have is that people don't ask for help before they do it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, God, through God's Spirit, convicts us, just like the psalmist talks about. And very rarely, I think, do good people get into the place where they don't have that conviction right before they do what they do. Maybe they don't. I can't imagine that most people that have been around church, that have been around the Spirit of God, don't feel that conviction right before they cross that boundary.
Oh, the big boundaries.
The big boundaries.
Right. Well, I think like what Kelly was saying though is a lot of time your senses are just numbed when you're surrounding yourself with people that are sinning. And then also when we know we're going to do something wrong, we're not going to ask for help because that shows weakness, but also we're not going to like the answer that somebody's going to give us unless we're asking someone from that sin circle. What do you think? And they're like, yeah, go for it. Do what makes you feel good. Do what's, feels good to you. We're not, I think a lot of times people aren't pausing they're just really going with, this is like about me and how I feel, and not a lot of times, which is a sin in itself, being selfish and not thinking about how these actions are going to affect everyone else.
Yeah.
And it's just selfish thinking about, how am I going to feel? I'm going to feel great. But down the road, I just think it's like in the moment.
Well, that kind of like that second word, iniquity, where there's a bent towards injustice, and it's sort of, I really like that word, that idea that we have sort of this bent towards this, that it's not just, okay, well, I'm going to do something wrong, but it's like we are kind of geared that way, to want. I mean, it's like our survival instinct, right? It is selfish by nature. Mm-hmm. And so being able to recognize that, and that we have a tendency to distort truth to get what we want. Well, if I do this, we were talking about adultery. Isn't kind of an easy one to bring up, but that idea of like, well, I'm unhappy. I'm sure she's unhappy. We may as well just, whatever. Mm-hmm. And we can distort a lot of things to make them seem like what we're doing is just.
Yeah, like it's okay.
Yeah.
In Bible study, oftentimes when we look at the creation story in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, which there are two creation stories.
Right.
The first creation story begins in chapter 1, and it talks about the 7 days of creation. And when you get to the end of creation, you look at creation, and it is so orderly. There is night and day. There are everything has a place and fits. And then you get to the second creation story, and at the end of it, you've got this family who is out of sorts with God, out of sorts with each other, out of sorts with creation itself. And I always remind people is, oftentimes we can look outside the window and we can look at a world that seems orderly. There's going to be storms, there's going to be seasons where, there's drought, but there's going to be 4 seasons in Inman. There is going to be morning and night. Everything's going to happen in its season. Yet you look inside the house, sitting around a table with your family, and you ask yourselves at times, why is it that this isn't as orderly? And the question becomes in the Genesis text is a lot of times we have chosen to put ourselves above God and above other people. And when we do that, if you go later into the biblical narrative and you look at the 10 Commandments, when you start to break the 5 through 6, honor mother and father onward, you start to disrupt not just your family, but society as well. When you take something that's not yours, that's a disruption. When you covet your neighbor's stuff, you are putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and saying, I'd rather live their life than mine, which usually leads to some sort of stealing or adultery or
Right.
something. When you take somebody else's life, that leads a disruption in society. And one of the things that we have to say is that a lot of times people think of their sin as just my stuff.
Right.
I'm not hurting anybody else.
They don't realize the domino effect.
And in reality, anytime we put ourselves in a place where we think we can control our own destiny, and that we think that what we do doesn't impact anybody else, the reality is it is a cascade effect that disrupts family, that disrupts community, that disrupts the life of whomever you're around, to the point that God would say, these are the boundaries you need to live in. It's not because God is a dictator, but because it affects more than just you. And eventually it will not just affect you, but it will affect other people's relationship with God. Because when you hurt other people, their hurt is affected in their relationship with God.
I thought that was interesting when the psalmist talks about that you begin wasting away, and I thought about like if you don't have water and your body begins to become dehydrated and how small that is at the beginning, and it really does kind of only affect you. But to pretend like when you become dehydrated and your entire family has to take you to the hospital and you're not able to do the things you do on a normal basis, even at the beginning, when your body is starting to feel the effects of that, it is like those sins that are internal, where you can think this is only mine. Yeah, your kids see that.
Yeah.
Your spouse knows when you're angry all the time.
Yeah.
When they have to walk on eggshells, or they're just wondering when they come home if the storm cloud has arrived or if it's going to be a sunny day because of your internal mood. Those are things that you think, well, I hold this inside, but you don't.
And then that carries on to like people in your workplace, and then that's affecting them when they go home to their families. It's just like a cancer. It spreads out, and affects everybody. And so we can't just think that our sin only affects us.
Yeah. So if sin is the cancer, we hear within the psalmist and the biblical narrative that forgiveness is the healing part that comes into our lives and heals us. And one of the things we see within the psalm is that God can forgive. Jesus would say, God forgives you, you must also forgive others. And I love that and I've said it hundreds of times, I love Jesus's, the Lord's Prayer, that Jesus connects forgiveness and daily bread together, because we need to forgive and be forgiven every day. There's not a day that I've not done something that's resisted God's will, that it's not just affected me, it's affected somebody else.
Right.
But Jesus also says, as you are forgiven, you must forgive. Because part of the cure for sin in the world is that if God has forgiven us in and through Christ Jesus, how can we not go out and forgive others? And it's only through forgiveness, through grace and mercy, that people can be restored in relationship. And it may not be even where we are restored in the relationship that we had, but at least we are stopping the spread of whatever the sin is. It's hard for me to think of sin just as an action, but it's also something of a force that happens, like a virus that spreads from person to person. And I think when Jesus, the Apostle Paul and others see what Jesus has done on the cross and understand that Jesus has come not just to conquer death, but also sin, is that through Christ, all things will be made new. And part of that is that they will be healed and redeemed from the corruption to which sin has impacted us. So where has forgiveness played a part in y'all's lives so that you feel not only whole and healed, but allows you to go out and to forgive others?
I think one of the hardest things is, as a Christian, is forgiveness. That's one of the hardest things we're called to do, for sure. And a lot of times it's forgiving ourselves for our own sin, It's really, I think it's easier to forgive others than it is to forgive yourself. But you just have to, that causes you to have reflection and look inward and say, yeah, I messed up. And then also, but it's okay. Jesus died on the cross and he's forgiven me. I've got to let go of this pain and stop feeling just so ashamed of sins I've done in the past, because that will eat you up in itself. So I just feel like It took me a long time to forgive myself for sins that I had done in the past. But once I finally let go of that and just thought, like, Jesus died on the cross for me. Mm-hmm. And that weight, that freedom that comes with it, that's where I've felt forgiveness in my life.
Yeah.
Yeah, it always reminds me of the passage in the Bible where Peter tells Jesus, don't wash my feet. And I think about that because we want to say, like I don't want you to give me grace. I don't deserve grace. And I would rather pay for my own stuff than have someone else do it for me, And but the truth is, how can we understand grace to give to someone else unless we've accepted it? Mm-hmm. And how can we give forgiveness if we've never accepted forgiveness? And so that's hard, mm-hmm. I think, to say, number one, I need it, which is the confession piece, but then also like, I need something that I can't do myself. Yeah. Like only someone else can do this for me.
And that's hard for someone with control issues.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say most people have control issues, and we don't like to be beholden to someone else. We don't like to owe someone. And that's what we feel like.
Or show signs of weakness.
Right. And so we have, but it is, it's like when Jesus talks about like those who have been forgiven much, it's easier for them to forgive because they understand like, and that's what, the psalmist is talking about, the freedom that comes from that, the freedom that comes from saying, hey, I'm not perfect. I'm going to mess up again and I'm going to have to admit it again to you. And the freedom that comes from that is to be able to say, look, everybody, I'm a mess. You're a mess too. Why don't you join me in this freedom of grace that God gives us? And then we can all, just admit that like we're not perfect and that's okay.
I think one thing we have to just be aware of is a lot of times I think people come to God and they are forgiven and they think, okay, everything's good. So I always think of the "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" and I think it's Delmar goes and gets baptized in the river and he comes up and he says, God has forgiven me for this and this. And God forgave me for that, holding up the Piggly Wiggly and stuff like that. And I think to myself, some people feel that way, that there's nothing else they need to do. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I love about, AA and some other programs that deal with really hard stuff where they've hurt people is they have to go and make amends. Mm-hmm. Part of becoming new in Christ is looking and saying, okay, there are areas in my life where I need to go. I've been forgiven, but I need to seek forgiveness from others. Mm-hmm. Because those other people that I've hurt, it has affected their relationship with God. Jesus says, if somebody has something against you, go to them.
Right.
Before you go and give your offering. Because you need to make those relationships right and restore those relationships because you are now living out the kingdom of God in your life, which is a kingdom where there is to make things right that were broken. And for us to be forgiven by God means that we've got to do the hard work of going and restoring all those relationships that we've broken. Maybe that we're not as close as we were, but at least we can ask the other person, listen, I've hurt you. And I'm not the same person anymore because of what God has done. And I need you to know that. And I hope that you can forgive me. You may not be forgiven by that other person, mm-hmm. but at least you can go and do the right thing. And I think there's a lot of people that come to Christ and think, okay, I've been forgiven. I don't have to do anything else. And that is not the restorative work of the Spirit in our lives.
Right.
It's hard to go and ask other people to forgive you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the call that many people stop with. And that's why there's still so much brokenness, even when we have been forgiven by God, that we don't go out and try to work those things out. What other thoughts do y'all have before we wrap up today?
Well, I was just going to say, earlier in our conversation, we were talking about kind of like coming back from sin. And I think that's what makes the forgiveness piece, like you were just talking about, so difficult, is that in our relationships with others, there's not a coming back. Yeah. You cannot go back to the way things were before you hurt someone. Mm-hmm. And that is the fear, right? Is that, well, they may not forgive you, and that the relationship will never be the same. No. And it's just a hard truth. But then it also is trusting in God to say, this may be better. Yeah. Mm-hmm. This relationship, though broken, may be more beautiful.
Yeah.
It may be, for sure, more honest. But that is walking into an area of life that is unknown.
Yeah.
Right.
And that nobody likes to walk into the unknown, right?
I was just going to say I had a moment with someone where I told them, I said, I'm sorry and I've forgiven you. And they were like, well, I don't really know what I need to be forgiven for. Mm-hmm. And I just had to walk away from that knowing like, okay, I've done my part. Mm-hmm. And, I have to be okay with that response. Yeah. And like you said, trust God in the timing and in the season, and just be like, well, maybe this is a relationship that's not good for this time in my life. Yeah. Maybe it was good for this past season, but not for the one I have coming up. Yeah. But it's freeing to be able to know, like, yeah, they don't even realize they need to be forgiven for anything, but just knowing that you took that step of reconciliation and restoration.
Yeah. For anybody that's listening today, if you are struggling with forgiveness, and a book I would recommend is Lewis Smead's Forgiving the Hurts We Don't Deserve. And most of the time, it's the people that are closest to us that hurt us the most. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that Lewis talks about in his book is learning to look at people with resurrection eyes. How does the Spirit of God work in our lives that we can get to the point where the people that have hurt us in many ways, their actions have caused us to see them no longer as alive. We talk about they're dead to us. Mm-hmm. And part of that's because what they've done to us has hurt us so bad that we can't look at them the same way anymore. Right. Mm-hmm. And he would say that part of real forgiveness is that we are able to bring them back to life. It may not be the same person that we used to have, but they are not dead anymore to us. That we can look at them and see them as a person made in the image of God.
That's so good. Resurrection eyes. I love that.
It's a beautiful book.
Yeah.
And I would recommend anybody that's struggling with forgiveness, go get it. Smeads talks about his own life. He talks about other stories. And he's got this great parable at the end. And I've used it several times in different places. So if you're struggling with forgiving, know that you're not alone.
For sure.
We're all in it together.
That's right.
This forgiveness is probably, for me, the thing that we should talk about more often in church, because it is the central point of what Jesus calls us to do. Not only to be forgiven, to allow God to forgive us and renew us, and that's all of what we talk about on Good Friday, is that we are sinners and we're saved by grace, we're saved by God's forgiveness. But we're called to live that out. And if anybody is living with unforgiveness in their heart, they should ask themselves, because Jesus says, the way you forgive others is the way that God will forgive you. That's hard.
Yeah. Feeling a little convicted.
That's a hard word, yeah.
If we were to have a sheet of paper that had criteria on how we would forgive others, God would say, I'll use that same sheet for you.
Yeah, it's so painful.
So we have to be careful when we, that's in Matthew and Luke after the Lord's Prayer. Jesus is very clear that the criteria to which you forgive others is the same criteria to which you will be forgiven. So we have to, when we live out our lives, we have to ask ourselves, are we willing to do what God has done for us for others? If we're stingy with our forgiveness, will God be stingy to forgive us?
Yeah. Like, are they sorry enough?
So,
are they going to do this again?
Which is a reminder that our relationship with God and our relationship with people are intertwined. They're not separated. They're not boundaried. They are always connected. So as you think about your sin in your life, as you think about the sin of other people, understand that what we do to one another is never in isolation. It's always intertwined in our worship of God, our love of God, and our justice, our righteousness with others, our love of others.
Yeah.
Everything's intertwined. Well, I think our time's about up. Any last thoughts?
No, I just am going to go and start working on some things. And I'm
Oh, we
going to
all
read
need
that
to.
book.
Yeah. All right, everybody, have a great week. And we're looking forward to seeing everybody looking through these resurrection eyes.
Yeah, go forgive somebody and yourself.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.